All right, let's jump right into this. Today, we're unpacking a true historical spy thriller. I'm talking about a single, seemingly innocuous, encoded message that literally shifted the balance of power in World War I. We're looking at the infamous Zimmermann telegram. If you've ever wondered what it takes to completely flip the script on global geopolitics and drag a deeply hesitant United States into a massive global conflict, well, this is it. It's a story packed with cryptographers, international espionage, staggering geopolitical gambles, and honestly, one of the most massive, history-altering mistakes ever made.
To truly grasp how big of a deal this is, we have to understand the unbelievable stakes of the intelligence coup we're about to unravel. Cryptography expert David Kahn puts it perfectly. He says, "No other single cryptanalysis has had such enormous consequences. Never before, or since, has so much turned upon the solution of a secret message." That right there, that tells you the sheer magnitude of what happened. We aren't just talking about getting a minor edge on the battlefield. We are talking about cracking a secret code that literally redrew the map of global alliances and ended American isolationism almost overnight.
But to really get why this was such an explosive event, we have to rewind just a bit to early 1917. You have to remember, the United States was strictly neutral. President Woodrow Wilson had just won re-election in 1916, and his entire slogan was, "He kept us out of war." The American public was heavily neutralist. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the grinding, bloody mess happening in the trenches of Europe. Wilson had firmly staked his entire presidency on keeping American soldiers safely at home. So, breaking that promise, it was going to require an absolute earthquake of an event.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann was hatching an incredibly audacious plot. In early 1917, the German High Command made this desperate, strategic decision. They were going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st. Basically, this meant their U-boats would sink any ship, even neutral American ships, that approached Great Britain. Now, Zimmermann wasn't stupid. He knew this aggressive move would almost certainly force the United States into the war against Germany. He desperately needed a distraction to tie up the American military in their own backyard.
And the sheer audacity of the plan he came up with is just staggering. On January 16, 1917, Zimmermann drafted a highly classified proposal to the Mexican government. His pitch? If the U.S. entered the war, Germany and Mexico would form a military alliance. Germany would provide, in his exact words, ample financial support. And in return, Mexico was supposed to make war on the United States and reconquer its lost southwestern territories. We're talking Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. He even suggested Mexico reach out to Japan to pull them into this whole anti-American alliance. I mean, this was a geopolitical bombshell aimed right at the heart of America.
So the big question is, how do you actually send a top-secret message like that across an ocean during a world war? Well, in a twist of unbelievable dramatic irony, Germany transmitted this entire plot to their ambassador in Washington, Count von Bernstorff, using American diplomatic cables. Seriously, you can't make this stuff up. Because the British had previously cut Germany's telegraph cables, President Wilson had generously allowed the Germans to use secure U.S. State Department telegraph lines, thinking, they'd use them for peace messages. Instead, the Germans exploited that good faith to transmit a plot to physically dismember the United States. Unbeknownst to the Germans, though, their communications were anything but secure. Right on the first day of the war back in 1914, Britain boldly cut Germany's transatlantic cables. That forced German traffic onto neutral lines that physically passed right through British territory. Because of this, British naval intelligence, a highly secretive, brilliant group known as Room 40, was actively intercepting all this diplomatic traffic. And thanks to captured code books they'd recovered from shipwrecks and even abandoned luggage over the years, these British cryptanalysts were quietly reading Germany's mail. So, the brilliant work of Room 40 springs into action. Imagine staring at a Western Union telegram exactly as it was forwarded from Washington to Mexico City. Just a massive wall of seemingly random encrypted gibberish. But the British codebreakers, led by folks like Nigel de Grey, recognized that this specific transmission used an older diplomatic code known as 13040. Because they had partially reconstructed this code over a long period of time, they were able to brilliantly transform those random numbers into a terrifying German military directive. But cracking the code created an agonizing dilemma for Britain. The chief of Room 40, Admiral William Hall, literally sat on this decoded message for weeks. Think about it. If they went with option A and revealed the telegram to the Americans, they risked exposing their own top-secret code-breaking operations, and Germany would instantly change all their codes. Plus, the US would be absolutely furious to learn Britain was secretly tapping American diplomatic cables. But option B was totally unthinkable. Keep the secret and just watch the US stay completely out of the war while German submarines starved Britain into submission. They needed a clever solution, and they needed it fast.
To get around this, British intelligence devised a genius cover story. They knew the message had been forwarded from Washington down to Mexico City using commercial telegraph lines. So they had a British agent down in Mexico, known to history simply as Mr. H, actually bribe a commercial telegraph employee to get a physical copy of the coded message right from the Mexico City telegraph office. This was brilliant because it allowed the British to hand the encrypted message to the Americans and essentially say, "Hey, look what we just bought over the counter in Mexico." It completely hid Room 40's existence and covered up their wiretapping of American cables from everyone involved.
Meanwhile, what about Mexico in all this? Did they actually consider invading Texas? Well, Mexican President Venustiano Carranza assigned a military commission to look at the offer, and they very pragmatically and very quickly rejected it as a total unwinnable fantasy. I mean, Mexico was in the middle of a civil war. The U.S. was vastly stronger militarily. Germany's promises of gold? Highly unreliable given there was an ocean and a British blockade between them. Plus, trying to pacify millions of armed, English-speaking Americans in those states would be an absolute nightmare, not to mention it would ruin relations with all their South American neighbors. For Mexico, the Zimmermann telegram was an instant, hard pass.
But the geopolitical domino effect of this interception was incredibly rapid. Think about this timeline. On January 16th, the telegram is sent. By February 24th, the British hand the decoded text and their clever cover story over to the U.S. ambassador. On March 1st, the news hits the American press. And by April 6th, the U.S. formally declares war. Just think about how fast this single intercepted document accelerated history. It shattered American neutrality almost overnight.
Now, you might be wondering, didn't people think this was just a fake? And you'd be totally right. When the story first broke, a lot of Americans, especially those who really wanted to stay out of the war, believed the telegram was an elaborate British forgery meant to trick the U.S. into fighting. But then the unthinkable happened. In a press conference on March 3rd and later in the Reichstag, Arthur Zimmermann shockingly confessed, "I cannot deny it, it is true," he said. He tried to brush it off as just a defensive contingency plan, but man, the damage was done. By verifying it himself, he completely and permanently galvanized American public opinion against Germany.
5 weeks. That's all it took. Within just 5 weeks of the telegram hitting the papers and Zimmermann's completely baffling confession, President Wilson, the very man who built his brand on keeping America out of the war, walked before a joint session of Congress. He asked for a declaration of war to make the world safe for democracy. The Zimmermann telegram, combined with the unrestricted submarine warfare, was the undeniable tipping point. It forced the United States into the global conflict, pouring fresh troops, endless resources, and a massive morale boost to the exhausted allies. Which really leaves us with one of history's greatest what-ifs. If Zimmermann hadn't been foolish enough to confess, or if those brilliant minds in Room 40 hadn't managed to crack diplomatic code 13040, or even if that British cable ship hadn't severed Germany's transatlantic lines on the very first day of the war, would the Allies have even won the First World War? How entirely different would our modern world look today if this single encrypted message had just slipped through unnoticed? It really makes you appreciate how fragile the course of human history truly is. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history behind the headlines.